Okay, welcome to Lecture 8, and today we're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system, and we're going to be applying some of the anatomical components that you should have learned in A&P 1, and kind of applying these to how does the heart function, how does the system function, and what are the components that are important for us in terms of how the cardiovascular system will function in a normal state. So what are the components of the cardiovascular system? Again, some of these first few slides will be a review for most of you, but the heart serves as the pump for the system. The arterial side is going to allow us to carry blood away from the heart towards the organs and active tissue. The capillaries will serve as a place for us to exchange gases and nutrients and then also pick up waste products. So our capillaries will be located not only in the muscles but also in all of the organs of the body as well. And then the venous system will carry our deoxygenated blood, or the blood that contains our waste products, away from the capillary beds and back towards the heart. So what are the functions of the cardiovascular system? Again, this should be a review for many of you. There are 6 major functions. One would be the delivery of oxygen and nutrients. Number 2 would be removal of CO2 and waste products. Number 3 would be the transportation of hormones. So again, hormones and the endocrine system function as a communication system, and the way in which they communicate is through the hormones being carried in the blood and having a direct impact on a effector receptor, essentially, or a target organ. Number 4, in terms of functions of the cardiovascular system, would be thermoregulation. So again, the blood serves as an excellent medium for us to carry or transport heat. So we can either decide to keep the heat in at our core, and we can do that through vasoconstriction of the vessels, or we can choose to send heat towards the skin surface to help us dissipate it more quickly and more effectively, and that we would do in a hot environment. And we can move that blood towards the skin surface. So we have control of where we actually send the blood. Number 5 would be acid-base balance, and so, we've talked about homeostasis and how, we have these narrow ranges that we would like certain components to stay within, and we would like to keep our blood acidity level within these various ranges. And lastly would be immune function. So the white blood cells are going to play an important role for us in terms of immunity and an immune function. In terms of the basic circulation of the heart, again, keep in mind that the left side of the heart will serve the pulmonic circulation. Let me get my little marker going here. So the right side will serve as a transporter to the pulmonic circulation, and the right side will then deliver blood to the lungs where it can pick up new oxygen and get rid of waste products. And the left side of the heart will play an important role in delivery of oxygen and nutrients via systemic circulation. And systemic circulation basically means that we're sending blood to the entire system. So the left side of the heart is going to play an important role in delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the entire body. Okay, some important terminology for us in terms of understanding cardiac function. Again, in lab, we'll be measuring many of these components, so now would be a great time for us to kind of discuss the definitions of some of these things. So the first is cardiac cycle, and the cardiac cycle is the oscillation between contraction and relaxation of the heart. So, the cardiac cycle involves one contraction and one relaxation. So one full cycle, essentially, of the heart. Okay. Stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected in one single contraction. Ejection fraction has to do with the percentage of blood that is ejected in one contraction in comparison to the amount of blood that was in that chamber to start with. So, for example, if we ejected, let's say our stroke volume was 100 mils. That's really low, but it'll serve as a good example for us. So let's say our stroke volume was 100 mils. Let's say you started with 200 mils in the left ventricle and you ejected 100 of them. So our ejection fraction would be 50%. So 50% of the blood that was initially in that chamber was ejected in a given contraction. Okay, so ejection fraction is going to be actually a fraction or a percentage related to the amount of blood ejected in comparison to the amount of blood you have to start with. Heart rate is the number of contractions per minute. Of course, this can vary greatly depending on the situation and from person to person. And cardiac output is the total amount of blood ejected per minute. So we're going to calculate cardiac output by multiplying heart rate, or the number of beats or contractions per minute, and you're going to multiply that with stroke volume, the amount of blood ejected per contraction. And that will tell us the amount of blood that's leaving the heart every minute. And that will usually be measured in liters per minute. So a normal cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute while at rest. AVO2 difference actually means atrioventricular difference. So I'll write that up here for you. Sorry, I said atrioventricular before. It's actually atriovenous difference. So we're looking at the difference of oxygen concentration in the veins versus in the arteries. And so if we take the amount of oxygen you started with in the arteries and you compare it to the amount of oxygen that is left in the veins, that would tell us how much oxygen we've actually delivered to a particular organ or tissue. Okay, so AVO2 difference will tell us the amount of oxygen that's extracted at the tissue level or at the systemic level. Okay, so again, cardiac cycle, as we just previously mentioned, is the oscillation between contraction and relaxation of the heart, and really two phases associated with the cardiac cycle. We have systolic pressure, which is the greatest pressure exerted on the vessel walls. So this represents the contractile phase of the cardiac cycle. So it occurs during the left ventricle contraction. And we have diastolic blood pressure. And diastolic is the pressure exerted on the vessel walls during the relaxation phase of the cardiac cycle. So when we talk about this oscillation between contraction and relaxation of the heart, we're actually referring to the oscillation of systole versus diastole. Okay, so systolic pressure in comparison to diastolic pressure. You're always going to be either in systole or diastole. So you're always either contracting or relaxing at any given time. Okay, so a couple other components to kind of define as we start talking about blood pressure. Again, blood pressure refers to the pressure exerted on the vessel walls. Again, we would want to measure this during contraction, which is systolic pressure, and during relaxation, which is diastolic pressure. We can also kind of determine the blood pressure based on two components. Number one is cardiac output. And again, cardiac output is the product of heart rate times stroke volume. How much blood is being ejected per minute? Okay, so this again is normally measured in liters per minute. And also TPR. And TPR is total peripheral resistance. Okay, so the amount of pressure in a vessel is equal to cardiac output. So how much blood are we sending through, and how much resistance does this blood need to overcome? Okay, so again, you can think about it in relationship to a garden hose. If we wanted to figure out how much pressure is exerted as this water flows through the hose, number one, we need to know how much water is going through. Do we have it on high or do we have it on low? Okay, so that would tell us how many liters per minute. That would be equal to the cardiac output component. The other thing we need to know is information about the tube or the hose that we're going to move this water through. Is the hose like one of those really big ones that they use, like the firefighters use? Or is it just like a really small little dinky garden hose that you have at your house? So again, how much resistance must be overcome in order for this fluid to move through the tube? So again, if we have let's say we have the water on medium and you have this tiny little garden hose. Okay, we're going to get a fair amount of pressure against those hose walls because the hose is pretty skinny or small in nature. Let's say you have the water on medium again, and now you have one of those huge fire truck type hoses. Okay, you can imagine that the same flow of water through that tube would create much less pressure because that tube is so much bigger in nature. So again, how much resistance must this fluid overcome tells us, one major component of what blood pressure is. Okay, so again, the two sides of the coin are how fast or how much water is flowing through the tube, and what are the components of the tube itself. So again, we need to know how much resistance must be overcome. So in terms of understanding the total peripheral resistance, or the amount of resistance that must be overcome in order for blood to flow through the tube, we must consider the components of hemodynamics. So as you know, the cardiovascular system is a closed loop system. So this means that there's a constant amount of blood that's flowing through the tubes, and the volume of blood stays the same pretty much all the time. So as blood flows, it's going to flow due to a pressure gradient. So we know that blood must flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And because this is a closed loop system, we must understand that the pressure must be highest as the blood exits the heart, and it'll be lowest where the blood returns to the heart. So that's going to establish a pressure gradient that will allow us to continue to move blood in a unidirectional manner, or in the same direction at all times. So in addition to understanding this pressure gradient, we must also think about the resistance that must be overcome, and also the relationship or the components associated with blood flow itself. So as mentioned, blood is going to flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So we know that when the heart contracts and blood is ejected from the heart itself, this represents the greatest amount of pressure that we have in the whole system. And as the blood flows then to the capillaries and then finally back through the veins, this pressure will continue to decrease, allowing us to set up this gradient, which is super important for us in terms of maintaining flow of blood. So let's talk about some of these other components. So in terms of resistance, a few things that we should mention. One is this funny little symbol that looks kind of like an N, and this represents viscosity. Okay, so I'll write that over here. And, oops, that's a Y. And viscosity is basically the thickness of the blood. So if blood has a high amount of viscosity, it's very thick in nature. So you could think about something with high viscosity would be like a milkshake, whereas something with low viscosity is something that's more thin in nature, like water. Okay, so viscosity is directly related to resistance. The thicker the substance is, the more resistance it has. So as we increase viscosity, we also increase resistance. Okay. Two other components associated with resistance, or two other things that will be important for us in terms of understanding how much resistance blood must overcome. One would be this L, and this L represents the length of the tube. And so you can think about this in terms of different types of straws. So if I just have a normal straw, like from McDonald's or whatever, let's say that's, 6 or 7 inches long. Okay, pretty easy for me to get my pop through that tube. Then I want you to think about one of those like twisty, swirly straws that you had when you were little, that are like neon colors and they're super twisty and twirly and everything. They were really fun to have in the summer. You can imagine the length of that tube, or the length of that straw, is like maybe 13 inches. Again, there's much more resistance for you to overcome, so it's much more difficult for you to slurp that pop through that straw because it's longer in comparison to the straw from McDonald's. So as the length of the tube increases, resistance also increases. The last component we should consider when talking about resistance is this R. And this R represents the radius of the tube. Okay. So again, think about different sizes of straws. So if I have, and I know some of you are not 21 yet, but you have probably seen those little mixer straws that you get if you order like a rum and coke or something like that. They're very skinny in nature. So the radius of those straws is not very large. It's a small radius. And so it's difficult for you to suck your pop through those tiny mixer straws in comparison to your good old McDonald's straw. So as the radius increases, that causes a decrease in resistance. Okay, so radius and resistance are inversely related. If I increase the radius, that reduces our resistance, or allows the liquid to flow more easily. Again, you can think back to our garden hose example. If I have a small dinky garden hose and the radius is small, that would increase the resistance, or it would make it harder for us to get water through that particular tube. Whereas if I have the big firefighter hose, which is much wider, much larger in nature, that water can flow through much easier. Okay, so as I increase the radius of the tube, I decrease the resistance to flow, and it allowed that flow to occur much more easily. The last thing to note with resistance in relation to radius is this 4 here. Okay, so r to the 4th power tells us that the radius of the tube is 4 times more important than any other component. So this tells us that as we change the radius of the tube, this has a significant impact on our resistance to flow. And it turns out, within the cardiovascular system, we cannot greatly change the viscosity of blood. We cannot change the length of the tube, but we can change the radius of the tube. So this is a one factor that we can manipulate, and it's also the greatest factor in terms of determining how much resistance there is. So how much blood is flowing is related to delta pressure, which is our change in pressure from one end of the tube to the other, divided by resistance. So as I increase the pressure gradient, this causes an increase in blood flow. If I increase resistance, that will cause a decrease in blood flow. Okay? If I decrease the resistance, and again, we talked about the factors that would be considered in order to affect resistance. So if I decrease the resistance, that would allow me to increase blood flow. Okay, so this chart kind of shows you the relationship between pressure, velocity, and total cross-sectional area. So again, this kind of applies those principles of hemodynamics to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so you can see blood pressure generally decreases pretty much steadily as we move from the arteries to the capillaries to the veins. Again, because we have this delta pressure, or this change in pressure from arteries to veins, this is what allows us to continue to move blood through the system in one direction. So blood will easily move from arteries to capillaries to veins. If you take a look at the total area, or total cross-sectional area, again, I want you to think about the radius of the tube in this situation. So as we move from arteries to capillaries, even though each individual tube gets smaller, we get more and more tubes, which is what allows us to increase the total area. Okay, so as we move from arteries to capillaries, we have an increase in the number of tubes, and therefore the total cross-sectional area if you would add all the tubes together. And that will allow us to actually slow down the velocity of flow as we move from the arteries into the capillaries. Okay. Again, this is a good thing. We want a high total cross-sectional area in the capillaries because we know the capillaries' function is to facilitate exchange. We also would enjoy for the velocity to slow down as we move from the arteries to the capillaries, because this would also help us facilitate exchange. So again, if the blood is moving slowly in this particular area, that's good news because it will allow us to have more exchange occurring within the capillaries. Okay. As we move into the veins, you can see that total cross-sectional area starts to decrease. So capillaries start to converge together to form a few larger veins, and as a result, we start to increase the velocity of flow slightly, although the velocity never increases to that of which it was in the arteries. Okay, so we've talked about the components associated with blood pressure, but let's get some average values out here for you. Again, we'll be actually measuring most of these components in lab, so we want to know what's normal or what we should be expecting to find within the lab itself. So let's start with systolic pressure. Again, we know systolic pressure is the greatest amount of pressure exerted on the vessel walls. And systolic blood pressure is measured in millimeter of mercury, so 120 is about a normal level. Millimeters Hg is the appropriate label for anything related to pressure. Again, I'm huge on labels, so make sure you use the appropriate labels while you're writing your lab reports. Okay. Diastolic pressure, again, we know is the pressure exerted during relaxation, and normal diastolic blood pressure would be 80 millimeters of mercury. Again, something below these values is okay. That's healthy. So, the standard or the average is 120 for systole and 80 for diastole. But, if you were slightly lower than that, that would be completely normal. Particularly for healthy athletic populations, we might see values closer to 110 over 70 or 115 over 65 or something along those lines. So it's okay to see values that are lower than this. I would expect actually in this class that we'll see, quite a few of you will have lower than average blood pressure levels. Normal mean arterial pressure is 93. So mean arterial pressure is equal to 1/3 systole plus 2/3 diastole And again, I want you to think about, okay, if we're getting the mean or the average of two pressures, why are we not just taking systolic pressure plus diastolic pressure and then divide by 2? Why is it that we're doing 1/3 systole and 2/3 diastole? And the reason and the answer to this question is because we spend 2/3 of our time in diastole and only 1/3 of our time in systole. So we're going to account for the time differences essentially. So because we spend more of our time in diastole, he gets to play a larger role in determining our mean arterial pressure. Okay. So again, a normal mean arterial pressure would be 93. Again, for the athletic population that we have in this class, it's certainly likely that we see values more like 85, 87, somewhere in that range. Would not be surprising. Prehypertension is something that you would want to keep your eyes on. Again, as we're headed towards hypertension, this is certainly something to take note of. So prehypertension values for systolic pressure is between 121 and 139, and diastolic pressures of 81 to 89. Again, if we happen to find your blood pressure in this class is 123 over 85, don't freak out. Of course, we are beginners within this class, and we'll talk about the components that could affect what your blood pressure is at any given time. So it's nothing to necessarily worry about if your values are a little bit high, based on what we measure in this given class. But the reason we want to keep an eye on prehypertension is we want to certainly avoid hypertension. And the reason we want to avoid hypertension is people that are hypertensive are at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, heart attack, many other things as well. So a slew of, preventable diseases, high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, stroke, cancer. So again, once you start getting one of these risk factors, you're certainly at a high risk for developing other conditions as well, and we certainly want to avoid that. Hypertension, again, is defined as high blood pressure, and values for hypertension are over 140 for systolic pressure and over 90 for diastolic pressure. So again, the reason that those are bad, so why is it bad to have high blood pressure? You're not only placing more pressure or additional strain on the vessels at all times, you are also placing more pressure on the heart. So again, placing additional strain on the heart would be a negative thing as well. So what happens to our blood pressure during exercise? So again, we'll actually get the opportunity to measure these factors in lab, and we'll look at exercise kind of in two different modes. So not only are we concerned with exercise in an aerobic setting, but we also want to know how exercise affects our blood pressure in terms of like resistance training, that sort of thing. So we'll actually get the opportunity to measure both within class, but to kind of give you an idea of what we should predict that we would see. During aerobic exercise, we're going to see an increase in systolic blood pressure, and a decrease or diastolic pressure will remain the same. While in resistance exercise, we should see an increase in both systolic and diastolic pressures. And we'll talk about why that is here in a hot second. So again, with resistance training, we're going to see an increase in both systolic and diastolic pressure. The contraction of the muscle during resistance training causes mechanical compression of arteries and therefore a decrease in blood perfusion to the muscle. Also, a decreased blood flow will activate the sympathetic nervous system, and this will cause an increase in cardiac output and therefore an increase in mean arterial pressure. Okay. How much, you're wondering, how much blood pressure increases normal? Well, it's related to not only the amount of muscle mass activated, but also the intensity at which you're working. So again, if we were to compare resistance exercises, so let's say you're doing a biceps curl in comparison to a squat. A squat is going to activate more muscle mass, so therefore we're going to see a greater increase in blood pressure there compared to with the bicep curl. And also think about the intensity of the exercise. Are you doing, body weight squats, or are you, lifting 200 pounds or something like that? So again, the more resistance or the higher the intensity is for you, the greater the change will be as well. Okay. With aerobic exercise, we will see an increase in systolic blood pressure associated with an increase in cardiac output. So again, the amount of increase that we see with systolic blood pressure will be directly related to intensity. So are you kind of just biking at an easy intensity? You might see your systolic blood pressure go up to 135 or something. Are you really working hard and really going for it and really pushing yourself? If so, we might see systolic blood pressure of 190 or something along those lines. So systolic blood pressure will increase linearly compared to that increase associated with cardiac output and exercise intensity. Diastolic blood pressure will remain the same or maybe even decrease slightly due to a few factors. Number one is vasodilation. So, we talked about the principles of hemodynamics and the radius of the tube being such a huge factor in terms of determining the resistance to flow. Well, with aerobic exercise, instead of seeing compression against the vessel walls like what we saw with resistance training, with aerobic exercise, we're going to actually see vasodilation of our arteries, leading to the skeletal muscle that's being utilized. So as I increase the vasodilation of these arteries, that will allow me to maintain the diastolic pressure. The other factor would be peripheral runoff, and this is the movement of blood quickly from the arteries through the capillaries and to the veins. So again, as we increase the system overall, we're also going to increase the speed to which blood will flow through each of the tubes, and therefore, speed up the whole process. In terms of exercise recovery, if we were to measure blood pressure immediately following exercise, we might see what's called an hypotensive response. Again, hypo means below, tensive, we're talking about tension. Okay, so blood pressure will actually be lesser. We have an immediate drop in blood pressure following an exercise bout. And this has to do with a few things. First would be when you stop exercising, our heart rates decrease, almost immediately. So let's say you were running as fast as you could and your heart rate was like at 190. Well, we can pretty quickly, within a minute or two, get our heart rate back down to maybe, let's say, 85 or something within a couple minutes. Okay, so we can very quickly decrease heart rate, but we cannot as quickly change the diameter of the vessels. So again, think about our hose situation. We've got this big old fire hose and we have the water on high. Now we suddenly turn the water down to a low value, like we said with a heart rate of 85 or something. So you went from, a high flow to something pretty low, like on low intensity. And therefore the tube is still really large, so we're still going to have a major discrepancy here. So because heart rate decreases so rapidly and the pressure or the level of vasodilation or constriction in the tube is very much so delayed. Okay. So let's move forward and talk in more detail about the myocardium and some of the unique factors associated with it. So again, you've maybe seen this slide before. Again, unique factors associated with cardiac muscle. It's striated, branched, uninucleated, and is involuntary in nature. Again, to compare and contrast this with smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, one of its most unique factors is certainly that it's branched in nature. Cardiac tissue cannot function without oxygen. So we absolutely need oxygen to the myocardial tissue at all times. If not, we will have a heart attack, basically. So at rest, the myocardium, or the heart tissue itself, the heart muscle, extracts about 70 to 80% of oxygen from the blood in the coronary circulation. That's a lot. I would say that's about double what our normal tissue can extract. So in terms of oxygen delivery, it's super important that we send oxygen to the heart, and the heart does an awesome job at being able to extract that from the coronary arteries themselves. Therefore, during exercise, it's essential that we increase blood flow to the myocardial tissue. So myocardial oxygen consumption, how does blood flow to the myocardial tissue change during exercise? Two things that will happen. Number one would be vasodilation. So again, similar to what we see with our skeletal muscle, keep in mind that the heart is a muscle also. And so we're going to have vasodilation of the coronary arteries, and that will allow us to send more blood to the heart muscle itself. Number two would be increased blood flow due to increased arterial pressure. So because there is an increase in arterial pressure, we also have an increase in blood flow. Okay? So blood flow to the myocardial tissue must occur during diastole, so when the heart is relaxing. Again, when the heart contracts, think about it as like squeezing your fists together. And again, as we have this contraction, this is going to also compress the coronary arteries. So during relaxation, when everything kind of spreads back out, that's when we need to deliver blood. Okay. So one other factor that we can measure related to the heart would be the rate pressure product. And the rate pressure product is an estimate of myocardial work, sometimes called MVO2. So again, we're considering the amount of oxygen utilized by the heart muscle itself. And again, there are two components associated with rate pressure product. We want to know, number one, the heart rate. How many contractions is this heart completing per minute? And number two, we want to know systolic blood pressure. What's the amount of pressure, or what's the amount of force produced by the heart with each of these contractions? So if we multiply those two values together, that will tell us or give us an estimate of how much the heart is working, and hence how much oxygen is needed by the heart tissue. So again, as previously mentioned, the myocardial tissue only operates aerobically, so we absolutely need oxygen in order for metabolism to occur. As mentioned, the myocardial tissue is excellent at extracting oxygen from the coronary arteries. It also has 3 times higher oxidative capacity compared to skeletal muscle. So it has a high mitochondrial density, and that's related to the mitochondria serving as the powerhouse of the cell, or the location for aerobic metabolism to occur. And also long-chain fatty acid metabolism is enhanced in these particular cells. Okay, so we can use fats as a fuel. We also are very effective at aerobic or endurance types of metabolism in this particular area.